Well, my name's Anna Campbell. I'm a local historian, particularly interested in the Woodhead Lead Mines, and I'm really looking forward to taking a group up there today because I can always learn something new from that. If you're planning on coming up to visit the lead mines, it is a private road from the bridge over the Carsphairn lane, but feel free to park either in the village where it's public parking, or you can occasionally people park down the old road just before the bridge at Carsphairn. It is on private land, but a lot of people do park down there. It's also a scheduled monument, so please take care not to spoil anything and leave everything as you find it. Sadly, it's deteriorating because of the weather, but we don't want any spoiling by the human population to add and accelerate to that decay. Before we start our proper walk, I'd just like to say this is Carsphairn Farm, well known in Covenanting times. The house was commandeered by Grierson of Lag, and in the building that's at right angles to the house at the far distance there, that's where his dragoons, the feared dragoons, were quartered. One of the Covenanters was chased up one of these hills here, up to that hill facing us, and was martyred there, was killed by the dragoons. He had been a fugitive really, travelling all the way from Dalry up through the hills and into these hills. He was hoping to get into Ayrshire. Unfortunately, he had a sword, and the sword caught the glint of the sun, and these eagle-eyed dragoons saw him, reported it to Grierson of Lag, and up they came, and he was killed up here. There is a stone somewhere up on the hill to him. I have never seen it, but for those who are really keen hill walkers, it's a great place. So we'll go along now. This will be the longest stretch without us stopping. Here's your first sighting of the chimneys of the lead mines. Those are the only surviving lead mines in the whole of Scotland. Not the lead mines, the chimneys in Scotland. It's all listed by the Ancient Monuments, listed since 1992. This fence line is a very good place to note if you ever want to go up to the David McMath Memorial. You might have noticed it on the way up. It's a conical shaped cairn on this skyline as you walk up the road from the farm up to here. David McMath was a young man who was about 26 in 1926, and he lived up here at the lead mines with his old father, David McMath, who I'll come to later on. Young David was returning from Dunmellington, but he actually had been weakened by an appendicitis operation. He got off the bus. He was anxious to get back to his old father. It was December, an old, very snowy time. Anxious to get up to his father, who was very old by that time, up at the lead mine here. And he trudged through the snow. He got off the bus at a place called Drumjohn. Some of you may know it. It's further towards Dunmellington. He walked over the hill, felt very weak, sat down to have a rest, and from that he never woke again. There was a search party sent up to look for him, and they found him as though he was asleep, just in the shelter of the dyke up here. They collected money and they built a cairn to him, and there's a record of the service which was held in June 1926. Service held up at the cairn, which was then built with its plaque on it, and it was a very wet day, but there'd be a lot of people at the cairn, and he's always been remembered as young David McMath who died in the snow, but he would have been born up here. But it's a quick way of getting up there. I'm not suggesting any of us do today, but it's another treat for another day, particularly if you're interested in some of the people that lived up here. So onward to the next stopping point, which is not so far now. Just to give very brief history, there's no shelter until we get to the top. But this is a village that was developed from bare hillside. So it could have been a hillside like that, or like behind us. But in 1838, there was nothing here. It was by mistake or accident that the tenant found stones that looked as though they had some kind of mineral in them, in this Garryhorn burn here. Colonel MacAdam Cathcart, who had married a MacAdam from Darmellington, because he married a MacAdam, he inherited her vast estate, which was 76,000 acres. This farm was part of it. In that inheritance were also a lot of coal mines in Darmellington, developing coal mines. So you can imagine the man was fairly wealthy, but there was a lot of good sides to him as well. I'll talk to him maybe when we've got shelter at the top. But here we have the smelters row of cottages to the left. Again, I'll mention them again when we're a bit closer. This area in the front here is the processing area. We have the refining house to the left, and in the middle was the separating house and the washing flooring, and to the right was the smelter. And I'll be able to explain the very complex grid of tunnels going up to the chimneys to take away the fumes. He was fairly enlightened, MacAdam Cathcart, because he had the interests of the lead miners somewhere in his heart. He believed in education. There's the school up there, you can see the facade of it. The houses are here. We're going to see more houses, because by 1851 there were 50 houses here. 1841 there were just 22. But most interesting, those chimneys are on the hillside, and the prevailing wind comes from behind them. So the prevailing wind would blow away the toxious fumes from the processing area, which meant that on the whole they were healthier here than they would have been at perhaps other lead mines. Main cause of death here was TB, but they had new cottages, they had slated roofs, so there was quite a lot going for them in the housing situation. Not so much, I don't think lead mining would be the greatest career job, but they were able to come here. A lot of them came from Wonlock Head. So we'll now go down to the processing area and I'll explain a little bit more. Well, here we are in the heart of the complex. This lead mine only started in 1838, or the lead was found in 1838, but by 1840 they had started processing all the ore. So behind me to my right is the refining house. And you can have a few moments exploring around the back of it afterwards, because you'll see flues that come out of this building here, go behind the building, right round the back of it. You can almost see a line round the back of it, and go past that building there and up there to the chimneys. Up there, on the way down, we'll see it's a bit like Piccadilly Circus. It's lots of interfacing places where the fumes could go up. To the right, probably to the left of that brick wall there, was called the washing flooring. So the lead would become brought down on bogies on some railway lines down there, and presumably unloaded and washed. But the significance of the washing flooring to me is that in 1841, I think, or maybe 1842, there was a meeting held there, chaired by the local minister, because it was about the time when the disruption occurred, which was 1843, when the Church of Scotland split into the Free Church and the Church of Scotland. Obviously a lot of these lead miners here were not happy with the Church of Scotland, and the Minister of Carsphairn was fairly sympathetic towards them, so they had a meeting here deciding what to do. At the end of the day, they built a church themselves up at Lamloch, which I'll show you the track to further up. So that was a the washing flooring. To the left would be the separating house. So that would be, presumably they would separate the ore from the stones, and I'm not sure how they did that. And to the left here was the refining house. There were 6,000 bars of lead made here. Silver is a byproduct of lead, and I know that in Darmelington at the old church there was silver communion cups given by the Cathcart family. Silver came from here. There are other bits of silver, but I wouldn't know where they are. So this was the actual hub of it. The road that you've just walked up now is the way in which the lead bars were transported to Darmelington and then onto Ayr, where they would be transported, I read once, to Liverpool. Quite an arduous journey for it. Now, the main production was really in the first 8 years. After that, it just started to slump, and by 1853, the lead production was pretty minimal. Yeah, there were two veins here. There was the Woodhead vein and the Garryhorn vein. I can show you where two of the entrances were. Impossible to get into now, but I would imagine that that's where the two veins would go. There were 7 galleries here, so it was quite deep, and in certain places in this dry weather the galleries have fallen in, so I'm not taking you anywhere near those areas today, but it is possible to follow the line of where the miners walked. The A713 was much improved in the 1960s and an immense amount of waste from here was used for it, and many years ago it was possible to get some stone from here, obviously before 1992 when the preservation order was put on it. So do have just a little 2 minutes, 3 minutes to have a wander around here. I'm going to show you, of those who might be interested, how they blasted the rock. And I don't think I showed you, Claire, last time. So if anyone wants to let into a little secret of how they blasted it, follow me. Otherwise, have a look around at how these tunnels went, because that's interesting as well. But this stone shows how they blasted it. They had a special tool which I've forgotten the name of. Yeah, it would be a drill. I can't remember the exact title of it. But so they would break the rock in that way. They'd split it. Further up we'll pass the bit where they're called the dynamite house, where they kept all the dynamite. We've stopped here at this dry lade. Well, it probably wasn't a lade. It came out of the underground workings. You can see the hole in the bracken up there. That was, I believe, an entrance into the mine. It has always been covered with concrete in the time that I have known it. And there's always been water here. So there's always water coming out of it. I was asked, what about cattle here? You've seen sheep. There were at one time hens, but the hens didn't thrive here because they would go and peck amongst the pebbles, and they would obviously peck up bits of lead, and their combs went very white, and that was the end of the hens. So they were not successful up here. Behind me is what was known as the Smelters Row. There were 5 cottages there. In the 1851 census, there were 36 people living there. I do remember this cottage here being used by the Boys Brigade, and it was in much better condition than it is now, but sadly it's been vandalised over the last 40 years and it's just been left now, which is pretty unfortunate. These smelters that lived here, they were the best paid because they're very convenient for their job. They were just across the burn. But they earned 18 shillings a week plus free coal and one or two other bargains, while the miners might earn 18 shillings maximum and the labourers 14 shillings, and the lead washers, usually boys, earned less. So there was not a huge amount of money being paid out. Whether they got this in a form of a bargain, I'm not sure. By that I mean they would earn the money, but they would have to spend it in the shop. So this is Smelters Road. There was somebody living here in the 1930s. There's been a little bit of discussion about which was the house that was last inhabited. It might have been this one, but it might have been the one at the top, which we'll get to eventually. But 1930s, 1950s. But there's more to tell you about the houses. So we will go up through this bracken up there, and we will follow the route of one of the lades. Lade is an artificial channel built usually like a sheep trough to carry water to the main working area. You can see the remains of the lade. You can see a line in the bracken up there going across, and that was a lade up there, and it covers quite a distance. 6 miles of them were constructed here, all fairly clever Victorian engineering. Another, just a short stop here. To our left you can see the line of the lade. Follow the line in the bracken, and at the far end of it was a dam, which was much deeper in those days because it took in water from the Carsphairn burn. And now you wouldn't be able to see. The Carsphairn burn is much lower than the dam that is silted up. But this would be quite a lengthy dam, lade. If you look up on the hillside there, you can see a hole in the rock about halfway up with some spoil in front of it. Oh, yeah. That is an old iron mine. Doesn't go in very far. I don't know what the connection with the lead mines was. I've no idea, but it did exist. I've never seen any written thing about it. Now from here we're going to cross into an area in which it's an interesting and I think quite amusing story to tell you. So we'll cut through here up to the corner of this dike up here. Here we are in one of the mystery fields here. We don't know why this field was an enclosed field. In 1982 I brought some what I thought were old people then. They would be in their 80s. I brought them here and said to them, "Could you find me the graveyard here?" Oh yes. Some of them came with their spades. It was a hot day, and one gentleman said, "I know exactly where there's a gravestone." It was in this field just over there. So he was enthusiastic enough to start digging. What he did hit was a lot of stone. But the other 3 people, instead of going to all the same places I had hoped they would, they completely spread around. So at the end of the day, we were none the wiser where there was a graveyard here, because quite a lot of people did die up here. We only have the records up to 1855, because that's when it was compulsory to register a death. But I think there were, in the Carsphairn kirkyard, there's about 33 deaths recorded on gravestones there. But there were more deaths in the Galloway News. Sometimes it was even in the Glasgow Herald. Mainly accidents that occurred here. So with regard to death, TB was the main cause. Nobody died particularly young. There was no real pattern with it, but a lot of people did die up here. And as we go through what I call the gate at the other end, I think to myself, now that was wide enough to let a cart through, and the cart would have coffins on it. Maybe people were buried here. We don't know. This is one of the holes that would have been an air vent. There were about 7 of these. There's this one here, there's one down below us, the next one, and then there's a few on the top behind where that vehicle is parked. Most of them have got rowan trees planted in them. That's not a rowan, but these two on the outside are. And the one we're going to next, they're bigger rowan trees, and I like to think that they were the followers of the original rowan trees planted by the miners, because miners were worried about wicked spirits. They thought the rowan trees would get them away. So further on, so we're walking up to that next circle there, and follow that track down there, and you'll see that we're walking past a completely dried up dam. It was called the Weaver's Dam, and it did provide water for the various lathes and to go into the centre. We'll have a proper look when we get to it. But why it was called the Weaver's Dam, I don't know. There were no weavers here. And no one with the surname. Most of these lead miners from working here came from Wanlock Head and Lead Hills in the early years. So they were experienced lead miners. They did get some help from the village men and the surrounding farms, but they tended to look down on the local people because they didn't have the skills. There is a record of some communication between the village people and the lead miners when they had a game of quoits just in the field, just beyond the heritage centre in the village. It went badly for the lead miners, they were losing. And as they came across the bridge to come up towards the lead mines, that would be the current bridge just below the heritage centre, tempers frayed because the local men were taunting them. It ended up in a fight, a massive fight between the locals and the lead miners. At the end of the day, a lead miner was killed. Somebody got the front bit of a cart, the wooden bit, and just hit him on the head, and the lead miner perished. After that, things calmed down, and the lead miners very quietly trudged home. There are no other records of any lead mining adventures into the village after that. But in the meantime, the Procurator Fiscal turned up, and I can't remember his exact words, but he told the inquiry told the man who was guilty, oh, it's okay, just don't do anything bad to the lead miners for 2 years. That was his sentence. Words to that effect. So he really got away with it. But certainly there were men from the village who came up here to work, because it was work for them, which they didn't have, but they had no experience of. Whether they became miners or just men that worked here, I'm not sure. One interesting thing was the lowest job of all was to be a lead washer, and that was usually the job of the boys. Pretty grim job, because they would have to wash all the soil and the muck off the rock that came down. And I believe they would have been the boys that would have been sent up the flues to the chimneys to scrape the lead off the chimneys. Very high content of lead and a pretty awful job to do. But they were the right size to do it. So they got that job. And there were quite a lot of young people here. Again, when we get to the school, see if we can find a bit of shelter there. Yes, there probably is around this side. I can tell you a little bit more about the school, which was built by Colonel MacAdam Cathcart. Not a usual thing for the proprietors to build schools, but it was a well-built school, built in 1843. First teacher was here 180 years ago. It's quite good that this year ends in 2021, goes with all the censuses. And he was teaching 22 children, but there is no record of where he taught them. But later on, by 1851, there were 49 children at the school. Now I'll be able to tell you about one or two of them when we get there. We'll try and find shelter probably on this side of the building, but feel free to look round the building. The far end of it, near the gable end, was the library. And there would be 1,000 volumes in that library, some given by Colonel MacAdam Cathcart. And I've got the catalogue of it. It's pretty dull, but it's pretty learned stuff. So miners were keen to educate themselves to get better education in life. And they certainly got it up there. And I'll give you a couple of examples when we get there. School behind me, built in 1843, but we don't know of any record of it after 1853. So we know of it for 10 years. 22 children were being taught in 1841, but not at this school because it wasn't built. But by 1851, there were, I think, 49 children at it. There were 2 pupils that stood out. Those of you from the Glen Kens will know about the Glen Kens Society. And each year was very philanthropic, and it would run competitions for the best handwriting and all those sort of things. Also ran a competition for the best dung heap in the Glen Kens, but that didn't affect anybody up here. One boy won first prize for his handwriting, and a lot of the handwriting examples, of which we've got some, were long words from the Crimean War. Sevastopol, Crimea, Balaclava. The other person who we still know about was the Reverend Stuart Wilson, who became minister in New Abbey. And if any of you know New Abbey Church on the Solway, there is the most magnificent window there dedicated to the work that he and his wife did there. So he has got an everlasting memory, and he was a pupil here. Apart from that, I don't know a great deal about the school. I know there were at least 3 sets of teachers. The second set had very, what I would call aristocratic names, came from Argyll. I would imagine that they would be related to the Fitzroy MacLean family. After they left here, there is no record of what happened to them. In 1853, there was a master and a teacher of English. But at around 1853, so many of the miners left. So the school would close, and they'd end up going to the village school. But by all accounts, it was a good school, plenty of interesting books to read. If you like encyclopedias and you have a thirst-quenching need for education, the books were here. There was a record in the Woodhead Miners' Library that they had a complaint in their minutes, which complained that the Carsphairn Miners' Library had not returned a book. Very bad. So you can see up to our left here, it's like a road. And we'll walk up that to the main number of houses that were here. Because in the 1851 census, if you have the energy, I'm going to ask you to provide the answer, which is go along the bottom row here and tell me how many houses were in it. I'm setting a task for you to do. You may already know the answer, but let's go and see. Well, here we are at the bottom of low row. Did anyone have the energy to count how many houses they thought they saw on this row?
Throw in 7.
Okay, that's a start.
I'm going with 12.
Another. Go in the middle somewhere.
8.
There were 10 houses here. And in 1851, 71 people lived in this row of houses. So, fairly overcrowded. But they were lead miners, there were lead washers, there were labourers. There was nothing to distinguish one type of work from anything else. Many years ago, I brought some ladies up here who had lived here in the 1930s. Old ladies, and they lived here because it was the only accommodation that self-employed people could get. Because by this time, the mines had long closed because no lead was produced after 1873, and the population absolutely dwindled, 5, 10, from about 1881 onwards. You're lucky if you hit double figures in the population. But they would be self-employed people, mainly drainers. Houses were not in great state by then, and the lady who brought up here, she said, yeah, I'll take you to my house, which is the end one of this row. And she couldn't get over what a ruin it was in, let me think, 50 years. It was about 1980. But she did tell me a story which was also told to me by her sister. Because round the corner here, I believe it's here or it's on the next row, there's a well, the remains of a well. And the sister lived up here in the 1920s. I think there was just one other house occupied. And it was a wild night. Her husband had gone to the village and she wanted water from the well just round the corner here. I think it's this corner rather than that one, but it does exist, honestly. And so she said to the children, don't come out, keep the shutters on, it's too wild, just stay there. She came to the well and she slipped in. Well, she knew that there's no point in shouting because there was no one to shout to. It was an icy, wet, gloomy night, very windy, and in the end she managed to clamber out, which had been quite a feat. She'd be a woman in maybe her 40s, but she was desperate to get out of this well. And she wrote to me about it in about 1980. Of course, she'd be she was in a home by then, but she remembered it so well. So if you feel like it, go round to the back here, have a look at the wells there. Should be able to see it. It's a circle of stone, of bricks. If not, carry on up to the next row, which is slightly better preserved than that. I don't suggest you walk along it, but again, I can fill you in about the number of people that lived there. So I've told you the number of people lived here in this row. I've told you how many houses there were. To save you walking along, I'll tell you it's 10 houses in the next row. But again, think about the number of people who lived in these two rows in 1851. And really convenient because there was a school down there. Their shaft that they probably went through was over there, which I'll point out to you. It was very, very convenient. But remember, there was a mile to the village along this road and a mile along the other road, the top road, to the far end where the church was. So extraordinarily isolated and terrible weather in winter. So let's move on to the next row. No shelter at the next one, so we will not stay there long. Now, anyone, any idea of how many people might have been along here? I'll tell you, it's a bit miserable to ask. There were 51 people in this row of houses. Again, same sort of setup as down below, except this was called high row and that was low row. Over on the left, some of you might have heard, again, not easy to see, there were lazy beds where they would grow potatoes. Here we are at the dynamite house. I know I can remember this when it had, the doorway was complete and there was a lintel across the top. And I have a photograph of it. Again, built away from the population. So if it blew up, hopefully nobody would be injured. Right, let's aim for a tree that's got enough shelter for all of us. We're sitting under 4 trees here, and these trees were planted probably by the management of the lead mine. Behind Claire is the garden. And I remember one gentleman telling me that he remembered the blue delphiniums in the garden. And there you can sometimes find the centre of the garden. I think it is split into 4. And there was a plinth in there at one time. If you look over to your right, you can just see beyond the tree the remains of some daffodils, which faithfully bloom usually the end of April up here. So at one time, this was a garden that was cherished. Flowers, probably potatoes, probably instigated by Colonel MacAdam Cathcart and looked after by the management. Before I get to the management, a little bit more about him. He married Jean MacAdam, who was the surviving child of Quintin MacAdam, who those of you who have any interest in local history will know his illustrious end was that he shot himself the day that he got married in Craigengillan in Dalmellington. He left a widow and 3 or 4 children, the oldest being Jean, who married Colonel MacAdam Cathcart, who was from, I suppose, Scottish aristocracy. Well, she brought lots of money to the marriage and a lot of land and a lot of opportunities. And this lead mine was seen as an opportunity because at that time, in the 1830s, he may have thought that this is a good time to mine lead because the price is starting to go up again after the Napoleonic Wars. But actually, it was really a disaster. By 1853, a lot of the lead miners left either to go to coal mines in Ayrshire or to go to America, where they went to mines in Pennsylvania. And we've had 1 or 2 people from there getting back in touch with us. Colonel Cathcart died in 1865 down in Leamington Spa, so he probably had another house down there. I came across a letter from him to one of my husband's ancestors some months ago, and he was asking this gentleman to say what rent he was prepared to pay for a farm in Dalmellington. And I was very much struck with the courteous way, pleasant way in which he wrote the letter, a letter that he could have written to any of his fellow aristocracy or lords. It was a very gentlemanly way to deal with a tenant. So he'd obviously built the school here. He gave bound copies of the Encyclopaedia Britannica to the library. So, and apparently he gave other donations of books. So he was a quite philanthropic, really. But moving on to this area behind me, this is where the house where the lead mines manager lived. A man called Charles Wilson, who came here from Monlock Head and lived here until 1871. So he had lived here for many years. He came in about 1838. He was the mines manager. His children are quite well documented. He had a son called Peter who went to Germany, and Peter married a German woman, and the German family preserved all the letters and the documentation and the correspondence that he had with his Scottish relatives. Another brother was Stuart Wilson, the minister of New Abbey Church. And if ever have a chance to look at the stained glass window in New Abbey, it is magnificent, dedicated to Stuart Wilson and his wife. And the daughter married the mines manager from one of these places near Newton Stewart. So that's all well documented. In that house behind us, which I found in much better repair 40 years ago, I heard a wonderful story about it, because it had 2 stories. And I was told that once there were cows here. I have never known cows on this farm in the time I've been here, but there was a cow there, and for some peculiar reason the cow went upstairs. Well, you can take this with a pinch of salt because it gets better. The cow, couldn't persuade the cow to come downstairs, so they had to get the horse to bring the cow downstairs. I think they succeeded, but who knows. In that house I do remember a fireplace I remember where they kept the salt. I don't remember any furniture there. I do remember an oven in there, but if you look in, there's not very much to see. And that's the house at this end. Next door to it is probably an office. Beyond that, going that way, would be the shop. Again, no evidence of anything being bought or sold there. And beyond that, the building, which is slightly at a slant, was the stable. And that was used until the 1920s by the family who came up here. The Cathcart family would come and stay in the schoolhouse occasionally. If you went further along, there's a track along here. It would get you to the Lead Mines Church, which is at Lamloch. If anyone is keen afterwards, I can drive up to Lamloch and show you where this church was, which would hold a lot of people. They built it in 1844. It was a free church. It only lasted till 1867, but there were 91 people who went there from this lead mine, and a few went there from the village. So it prospered for a very short space of time, but it was rather a beautiful building. There are photographs of it. Cathcart was not at least sympathetic to anything that broke away from the established Church of Scotland. The landowner, just on the other side of the dike, a mile away, was a Mr. Macmillan, who was much more sympathetic towards them. He first of all allowed them to worship in his kitchen, and then they moved up to the church, which was maybe 50 yards from the house. But it is just over the dike on his property from Colonel MacAdam Cathcart's property, who obviously did not approve of the free church. But he was benevolent enough to allow the minister of Carsphairn Church to meet with the lead miners in the washing flooring down the place where we first stopped. So he was liberal enough to allow them to meet, but not liberal enough to allow them to build their church on this ground. I've stopped here because there are a few rows of houses down here, again miners' houses, but these tended to be a collection of maybe 3 or 5 houses, and the miners, it was called after the miner. So there was Bones Row, there was Weir's Row, and they were sort of dotted around these hillsides here. I think there's probably some up here and here, and just down by the roadside there. Where those 2 trees are over there, that was another area where an old gentleman went to dig for a grave. So really, they covered the whole area, looking for the churchyard here. We're really here in the centre. This is where, behind me, is where all the spoil was. There was a water wheel up here, some machinery, which I have to say I had not much interest in. If you can imagine the spoil being about 5 times the height that it is now, that was removed for the A713 in about 1965. Wouldn't be allowed now. And I think down the centre there was the bogies ran. I do know of 2 gentlemen that in their childhood went down on the bogies from the top to the bottom. So that would be how the stone was transported from where they got it out at the top, down to the bottom, down here to the separating house, the washing house, and all the other processes. I don't plan on walking through that middle bit. There's bits of interest in it. If you came here on a cooler day, might be worth walking through it. But there's obviously a lot to tell that I can't tell you because I don't know the answers. But the industrial process was obviously quite concentrated, but really it only lasted 30 odd years. But I can't really understand any of why there's certain levels here. There was water. Water was always a problem, water flowing through it. Where we first talked at the processing bit, I know there's water coming out there when it's wet. Nothing now. I decided to stop here so that if anybody wants to go up to the chimneys, they're very welcome. I don't think I'll be going up, but I can explain it from here. If you look to across here, there are various tunnels that come up bringing the fumes. It's quite difficult to see actually, but there is one I think that probably comes out just there, and the main ones come up here, and then if you go across there you'll see it's a bit like Clapham Junction Station. They're interlocking shafts that are quite amazing. They could shut them off when they wanted to. They could shut off some going to one chimney, direct them to another chimney, and the shafts are most beautifully built. There's a lot of windstone. Some of them are collapsed. I wouldn't advise you to try getting in them, but they are rather beautiful, and I'm told there's some rare ferns growing in there if you're interested in various bits of bracken. But the chimney on the left, yeah, I remember it being higher. They are decaying, and as I said earlier, it's protected area, but it's not protected from the elements, and they are suffering. In not too many years that chimney will come down. But if any of you'd like to go up and have a look, please feel free. I will dawdle on the way down. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, that was a fabulous trip up the Woodhead Lead Mines with Anna. She's so knowledgeable. She's done such a lot of research into it over the years, and absolutely fascinating to be out there and able to see it on this glorious Galloway day as well. We're all a bit hot and sweaty, but we avoided the midges and the clegs. So this was part of the Galloway Glens Summer Events Programme 2021. It's July 2021 just now. The events programme continues, and we're trying to record as many of them as possible. So do have a look on our other videos on our YouTube channel if this is of interest, and if you'd like to come along to any of the events, then best way is to follow us on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram, or join up our newsletter, or have a look on our website www.gallowayglens.org. Thanks as ever to the National Lottery Heritage Fund, who support the whole Galloway Glens partnership scheme and allow us to put on these events to help our local communities engage with their heritage in such a meaningful and long-lasting way.